Hi, my name is Brandy Smith, and I am going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of cell grazing in a farming operation and how to maximize your profitability using the cell grazing techniques. So I think that we can all agree that to have a business, it needs to be profitable. You've got salaries that need to be paid, bills, expenses, you name it. To sustain a business, it has to be profitable. Otherwise, you're supporting the business and the business is not supporting you. It shouldn't be that way. So today I'm going to talk about cell grazing and how it can maximize a farmer's profitability. If you're not familiar with cell grazing versus conventional grazing techniques are two very different things. A lot of farmers today think that they're doing rotational grazing, but if you use less than 8 paddocks to rotate, you're really rotational overgrazing. That doesn't work. Cell grazing is when you have typically more than 20 paddocks to move your livestock from, and you start in paddock 1 and you rotate them on a daily basis or every 2 days, depending on how many cows you have per acre, the kind of grasses that you grow, and how big your cattle are. That makes it that goes into factor too. So for instance, I have a 60-acre farm and I have my farm divided into 26 2.3 acre paddocks, and my cows start at pasture 1. As you can see in my slideshow, they start at pasture 1 and I move them on a daily basis. Sometimes I can get away with moving them every 2 days, which increases the number of days that before they return to paddock 1. So we make the whole entire pass, and if I move them on a daily basis, they won't return to paddock 1 until 26 days, a full 26 days before they return to that. So what does that mean to you? Well, it means that pasture 1 and all the other pastures have adequate rest. The grasses are going to grow back. It's all got good rest to it. And that is what causes conventional grazing to minimize your profitability. You're going to feed more hay in the winter, you're going to have less grazing periods, and so on. So the cell grazing has a lot of advantages to it. The first one I'm going to talk about is the advantages for your soil. As farmers, we have to invest in our soil. The soil is what grows the grass feeds the cows, cows feed your happy customers. Less hay being fed. And you may have questions like, well, how is this going to help my soil? But really, it helps a lot. And what happens is when you have cell grazing, you have a certain number of animals in one area. And so that creates uniformity grazing. You'll have a cow you have cows that make the cow trails in the pastures, and it takes out all the grass, it does soil erosion, water runs off of it, grass doesn't grow on it, So when you do uniformity grazing, which is where you have a certain number of animals in a paddock for 1 or 2 days, and then you move them, all the cows are eating in that particular area. And when that happens, the whole area is getting eaten first, and then it gets trampled. But hopefully, if you do it correctly, it won't get trampled. So many farmers think that they are investing in their soil by applying fertilizer. Fertilizer costs us thousands of dollars a year, and it is not worth it. Many farmers think, well, it makes my grass grow, and so on. It does, but you can make your grass grow, get healthier soils, get healthier cows just by doing cell grazing. So cell grazing, the way it works is you've got your cows in a set number of pasture, like one at a time. When they go into that pasture, they're going to eat the best plants first. That ups their nutritional value, and the weeds that are in that pasture get trampled into the ground. Or maybe your cows even eat the weeds, but it gets trampled in the ground regardless, depending on how long you keep them in the pasture. So your cows are getting better nutrition. The land is getting fertile just by being in uniformity grazing. the weeds are getting trampled into the ground, and the soil is having a better chance of penetrating the water instead of letting it run off or just sit there. So all in all, it creates healthier soil. The next step that I'm going to bring in, so the healthier soil without the fertilizer. That leads me to my next point, and probably my favorite one about cell grazing. You can increase your stock density per acre. So I've got 60 acres, and I'm sustaining 45 cows on that 60 acres just by doing cell grazing. And so that's huge. It's like I'm getting a second farm for free because I've doubled up my cows. Before I started doing cell grazing, I still had the same 60-acre farm, and I divided it up into three pastures. And what I done was kept my cows in there for about 2 months at a time, and then I rotated them. So I was only able to keep maybe 20 cows on that 60 acres. The rule of thumb is that you want to have 3 acres per cow. I was pushing it at 2 acres per cow. So from that, from doing cell grazing, I've increased to 40 cows, doubled my herd without increasing my land, which in return decreased my production costs. Stock density, the more number of animals that you have on per acre, the better. Because like I mentioned earlier in the improving your soils, the more cows you have on per acre, the more uniformity grazing, the better and healthier the land is. So if you can have more cows on your farm without increasing the land and without increasing production costs, why not do it? If I had known about this sooner, I would have done it a long time ago. I would have shown my dad a long time ago. So it's really exciting, really exciting. So I'm going to talk about one question that is probably popping up into your head. And right now you're probably thinking, well, won't this increase my labor and my operating costs? The truth of it is, it doesn't have to. It will if you don't do it correctly and you don't take the time to research. However, it does not need to increase your labor and your operating costs at all. All it takes is setting up multiple pastures. You don't have to set them up all at once. All you have to do, I use little orange flags, and I go through once a week and I set up my next 2 pastures. I use plastic T-posts, which are cheap. They're like $1 something a piece, and I use electric wire, 1 strand, and I use a solar electric box, and it does the job really well. The cows, they get used to the electric fencing. When they have plenty of good forage to eat at first, they stay in that field. They don't have a reason to want to be out of it. And as long as you rotate them on a daily basis or however you need to customize this to fit your herd and your individual goals. Cell grazing, the fencing can be temporary, it can be permanent. That depends, again, on your individual goals, how many animals you have per acre, how large your animals are, which plays a huge factor into it as well. It all depends. And I can move my entire herd of cows in less than 20 minutes. Usually it's about 10 minutes, sometimes 15. Moving a larger herd is not going to take double the amount of time either. It's the same number of cows. Once you get into the routine, they're going to move from one pasture to the next with no problem at all. That's the ideal. And another question that usually pops up, which I wondered about this too before I started cell grazing, was if I'm creating smaller paddocks, what about my water sources? That was a huge question, and it made me put cell grazing into a negative state of mind for myself. On my 60-acre farm, I have 3 ponds, and so originally I divided that up into 3 pastures with the 3 ponds to go with it, so I didn't have to create any additional water sources. So using cell grazing, I'm using some temporary water sources. I'm making good use of my streams, good use of my ponds and everything. But one point that I will bring up is that studies have shown that when feeder calves are given access to a trough instead of a pond, they gain up to 30% more than those who just had access to a pond. So that's a huge thing about it. And when we have permanent water sources, and you'll notice that in your conventional grazing techniques that you use right now, animals usually congregate around those water sources or around their shade sources. That creates soil erosion. The water tends to run off the soil easier. All that grass is getting trampled even worse than in cell grazing, and your good grasses are going to be gone. They're going to have no recovery period, which is crucial to having healthier soils. So the water sources does not have to be a big deal unless you make it a big deal. You can create permanent water sources if you have permanent fencing. You can create a water source that provides water for up to 4 paddocks at a time, or maybe even more paddocks at a time. It depends on how you set it up, how much you research, how serious you are about improving your land and improving your profitability. So you can set up the temporary water sources where you move it with each paddock. That works just as good as a permanent water source, and that reduces the risk of your animals congregating around that certain area. So water sources, it doesn't have to be expensive to do. It doesn't have to be complicated. Just research it adequately. Make good use of your streams and your ponds. If you don't want to worry about the water troughs, make good use of your ponds. Plan around your ponds. Plan your pastures to have a corner of each pond or something, or use your streams to your advantage and your creeks. If you have natural springs on your farm, which is what I have, I make good use of that, and it's not been a big deal at all. It's been very easy. The advantages outweigh the disadvantages by far, and it's not been a big deal for me. And another thing we're going to talk about is, with smaller pastures, it can be more difficult to have adequate shade, which is a concern in the summertime, especially in different environments. We all want our cows to be comfortable, and we want more profitability per cow, per pound, per acre. So that's important. My suggestion, I have worked with nature. I don't work against it. So I have good use of trees in my fields, and I make good use of them. I use them to my advantage. I watch the weather more carefully these days, and I strongly believe that farmers are the best weather forecasters there are. So we need to use that to our advantage. We can watch, if it's going to be hot one week, then we can put our cows into the pastures that are going to have more tree access, more shade. And on cooler days, we can use the pastures with no trees, which will really help with the shade, and use it to your advantage. Don't make it more complicated than it really is. Another question that I often hear is that I already have adequate grass. I already do rotational grazing. I don't need to do this. I'm already making a profit. That's okay. You don't have to use cell grazing to be profitable if you don't wish to do so. But the thing about it is, many farmers think that they are being very profitable. But the truth of the matter is, they're getting subsidized. They have part-time work off of the farm that they're pouring into the farm, and we can't afford that. We may be able to sustain that for a few years, or maybe even up to 10 years, but we cannot sustain that for a lifetime, or even for 50, 60 years. I plan to be in the farming business for a long time, up until my retirement and past then. So I needed to come up with a way to sustain my farm, increase my profitability, and be done with it. So you may have adequate grass, but you have a lot of acreage, I assume. When you have a herd of 50 plus cows, a lot of farmers have 200 plus acres. That's what I see a lot of times. Otherwise, you're feeding more hay, you're feeding more grain, you're having to use more fertilizer. Those are all things that cost money. That's what we want to eliminate or greatly reduce. That's very important. So As a farmer, you cannot not invest in your land.